Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture on representations of and by Native Americans or American Indians. I want to start off like I usually do with saying a few things about kind of the general context and the big thematic that we're dealing with here today. We've already broached the topic, but it's worth saying again that, our thinking about as a nation, Native Americans or the Aboriginal peoples of North America is something that is, fraught with all kinds of different tensions. There are times in history where we are enamored with their exoticism, where we're really curious about who they are, where we're frankly really trying, I think, hard to understand these other peoples. But that pales relative to moments in our history in which these peoples and their claims to, frankly, their ancestral homelands and hunting lands and so forth gets in the way of our own ambitions. And that's part of this history. There are these moments where we romanticize Native Americans, and we still do it today. And there are these moments, much more frequent, in which we vilify, demonize these series of other cultures. It's worth saying, of course, that we use this term Native Americans or American Indians, and yes, there are various similarities between the different tribal groups, but of course they're all their own cultures in a way. Well, what I want to talk to you about today primarily is the way that painters and a few sculptors represented Native Americans in the 19th century predominantly. Not exclusively, but predominantly. And first off, note that we're using, and we've been using this term so far this quarter and will continue to, representations. When someone says representation within visual disciplines, they're really meaning to put you on guard. They're meaning to say, as I am, these aren't presentations. These aren't accurate, documentary, factitious, objective, visual forms of these people. These are representations. They are taking something that exists as, in this case, people and cultures outside of ourselves and filtering the way that we understand those cultures through our own sensibilities, through our own ideologies, our own desires, and then representing these peoples in a way that is inflected or mediated by those ideological kind of positions here, right? A big part of this, a big part of the way that we talk about this in post-colonialist theory, right, the study of groups of people that were colonized and, what effects that has on them and strategies for dealing with those issues that it presents in the present. One way we talk about this is cultural others, right? And I'm going to guess in some class at this point in your life or just in common conversation, you will have come across the term other or othering. Now, generally speaking, sometimes this gets collapsed into the idea of prejudice against people who are not like the dominant group, and that is certainly a big part of it. But a cultural other is a part of basically the way that definitions work, the way that when one culture claims an identity for themselves, says we are this, they will oftentimes juxtapose or contrast that this is what we are as, U.S. citizens, this is what we are as Americans, against something that they perceive to be opposite of that, an other. And the big other in the United States was Native American groups. Now, the reason this unfolds this way is, on the one hand, it's a way that definitions work. Again, I just want to say, if you're going to make any definition and say, this is what this is, you're also, at least implicitly, saying, this is what this is not. The not part is the othering part, but it gets more complex than that, of course. In the case of Native American groups, frankly and simply put, they were in the way of a lot of ambitions of the United States. They held territories that we wanted claim to. They weren't assimilating in the way that we wanted. We got into violent conflict with various groups for reasons that I think are pretty predictable. Imagine someone showing up in your backyard, setting up a tent, and then building a house there, and you're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Of course you're going to have conflicts between these different groups. But we felt justified in our actions towards these people, again, for reasons that we've talked about briefly so far, which is we firmly believed in the superiority of Western culture over these tribal peoples. We believed they were existing at an earlier stage in kind of social evolution. Sure, they were curiosities and we were curious about their exoticism, but let's be honest, people said at the time, they either need to catch up to us or their way of life is doomed. The big way that we othered, just as a general idea, the big way that we othered Native American groups was on a binary opposition in the way that othering works. Binaries, this versus that, right? Two different poles. Was to say, we are civilized and they are savage. We have to do everything with the advance of civilization and progress towards a future that is as yet unrealized, but that's where we're going. And they're back there in the past associated with an earlier savage state. That's the big binary on which a whole host of very particular representations are founded. Now, this has always been the case that we had various conflicts and various moments of détente with Native American groups. But in 1830 in particular, when Andrew Jackson is president, he's a very nationalist, very, very populist president. I don't want to draw too many parallels, but the current White House looks quite a bit like what was going on at the time, talking about Trump and so forth. Andrew Jackson started the process of moving various groups of Native Americans who formerly we had treated with onto reservations. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act that started this. And this is just an uprooting of one tribal group after another tribal group and a relocation, the most famous of which are the Trail of Tears relocations that started in the 30s, of moving people all the way across the country. As many as 60,000 Native Americans in the Trail of Tears removals or relocations were moved over 5,000 miles on forced marches. Thousands died during these marches in order to, again, put them into a place that was not their own home, that they didn't have any ancestral ties to, they didn't have any hunting grounds. And frankly, honestly, a lot of these problems that we caused back then for those groups still exist today for these populations in various parts of the United States. And it's worth, when we feel, when we see this occurring, when we see Native American groups, wanting to be heard, it's worth remembering this deep history, I think. So, 1830. Big moment in time. All the way through the 19th century, at various moments, we were in conflict. By the time just following the Civil War, particularly in the late 50s, 60s, 70s, we are in a series of armed conflicts against the Native American groups, primarily in the Plains area, known as the Indian Wars. By the end of the century, we have pretty much eradicated most of these people and placed them on reservations. So then, what else do you need to know before getting started on this? Well, I think it's worth talking about two other big concepts that were at play at the time, especially as we moved further west, which are moves that don't really happen until around the middle of the century. At this time, most of the American population and most of the cities and so forth is really on the eastern seaboard up to the Mississippi River. But there's not much going on from that point further west, even though we know Lewis and Clark go out there and explore. Various trappers and traders have been out on the west coast. But it's not really being populated until after the Civil War, where it really gets going. And then we kind of backfill into the plains areas, which creates all of these conflicts. So again, start on the eastern seaboard, following the Civil War, more and more moves to expand further westward, lots of governmental programs to give people land and to get them out there to make use of the natural resources. And then, of course, the gold rush doesn't hurt things, where people are running out there to make their fortunes. After we start settling the West Coast, we kind of move back into the plains areas. A big concept at this time, it's a term that's coined in the middle of the century, but the idea had been out there since, frankly, the founding of this nation, was what became known as manifest destiny. I'm going to guess most of you have heard this term before. Generally speaking, again, what this meant was it was not only our right as Western civilized peoples to expand over North America, thus, taking the ancestral lands of various native populations, not only our right given to us by God, that's what the manifest part is. It's a reference to Christian manifestations of God's plan. It was also our duty. That's what people firmly believe. It's not just, hey, you have a right to go do this. It's them thinking that God is saying you have to do this. And the reason that God's saying you have to do this is people, again, really believe that Americans, meaning colonial Americans, now U.S. citizens, have the right and the duty given to them by law, God, to go off across this nation and populate it and to make use of the natural resources that we've found so as to advance, to progress. And progress will be a big term that we'll keep coming back to today and beyond. So again, not just your right, your duty. And why? Because God has given you this land. You are a kind of chosen people. Yeah, there are people here already in your way, but it's their job to either get into your civilization, right? Assimilate. By the way, even though we said that, we didn't really let them assimilate in ways that many of them had great deals of success, or they were going to be wiped out, because after all, civilization was progressing and advancing. We needed to go out, find places to live, make use of the natural resources that were there as basically like the fuel to, the fuel or natural resources to fuel our economy so as to provide the basis for our progress and advancement. Another big idea at the time is what was known as the Evangelical Democracy. I'm sorry, I still see vestiges of this around all the time today. It's the idea that democracy somehow was the preferred governmental system of God, and that we as a nation had everything going for us. We had the most advanced, most accepted form of government by God. God had given us this prime, pristine landscape so as to create room for us to grow and fuel our economy with all the natural resources that we would find here. Right? We were a kind of chosen people. And it's not just politicians that are saying this. It's, frankly, church leaders are saying this. It's part of the popular literature of the time. It's in the poems of the time. It's even a part of little parts of our philosophy of the time. It's just everywhere to be found. Okay, well, that's a good kind of basis to where we want to start off. Now let's look at some of these images. The major reading that I gave you for this week was Robert Hughes' American Visions, a chapter, and you'll read it in two parts this week on the representations of Native Americans, and next week a focus on landscape painting. It's very closely aligned with these ideas, by the way. If you think of both the representation of Native Americans as being representations of our cultural other, and thus being a part of the way that we fashioned our sense of national identity, again, in contradistinction to these cultural others, these savages, the landscape as well was a huge part of the way we thought about ourselves. This was something that made us different than every other Western culture around. It was filled with the potential for progress. But we'll come to that next week. In that reading by Hughes, which, by the way, is Hugh's basically taking ideas from Julie Schimmel, whose article and her books on this subject are incredibly important. She's kind of the originator of these ideas. Has also been given to you as an optional reading. So if you get curious about this and you want to see more details about this subject, read that optional article by Schimmel. So let's start with this one. This is an artist we've already met before. This is John Vanderlin. It's his work that is titled variously either The Death of Jane McCrae or The Murder of Jane McCrae. It's an early painting by the standards of various paintings of Native Americans, 1804. We had already, of course, seen at least a few representations of Native Americans, but this is where they really, really get going. John Vanderlin's one of those artists that we talked about in the last lectures as going off to France, in his case, England, in the case of others, to train in the style of the grand manner. And then he attempted to, as you'll recall, import that style back to the United States with very, very limited success, if you can even call it that. Frankly, for most of these artists, it was an abject failure to bring classical ideas in the grand manner style into the United States, as they were seen as too elitist. He did find success, though, with this painting and others kind of like it. This painting was originally painted, as many were, as the starting point for something else. He would paint this painting to illustrate a scene from a famous poem by Joel Barlow called The Columbiad. And the Columbiad was basically an epic poem that told the story of the first colonizers of North America all the way up to the Revolutionary War. Very, very long epic poem. I would be surprised if in your, American history classes in high school or in literature classes, you didn't get a little stanza of this somewhere. But in any case, in one of those episodes of this long epic poem, he tells the story of the death of Jane McCrae, who is murdered by two Mohawk warriors who have been paid by the British. Now, what this does here, as you'll see, and the poem starts it, right? The poem starts this, is to collapse together two of our rivals or two of our enemies into one kind of composite. The Mohawk warriors have been paid by the British. We're in conflict with the British. We're in conflict with various Native American groups. Now we can put them together. They've been paid by someone else to do this thing. This, as I said, was meant to be an illustration. He would paint this up as a painting, and then he'd turn it over to an engraver to turn these into engravings that then could be printed alongside the poem. So let's visually analyze then this, as Hughes does. There's some really important things to point out about this. First and foremost is Hughes, again drawing from Julie Schimmel's work, says there are basically three stereotypical representations of Native Americans during the 19th century. Now, there are more that don't fall into these categories quite neatly, but it is worth saying these ones turn up all the time. And what you're looking at here is the demonic Indian, right? The demonic Indian. We've already met the noble savage when we were looking at, in particular, Benjamin West's The Death of General Wolfe. Here we have the demonic Indian. The idea behind the demonic Indian is that he's pure savagery. This is not something that's redeemable. It's not like the noble savage where you believe he has some innate nobility that can be cultivated. In this case, what you're saying is something like, nope, no nobility there at all. Left to their own devices, they will lower themselves to the lowest common denominator. They're not to be trusted. They're out there bloodthirsty, savage people, kind of like wild animals that you can't reason with or rationalize with. They're out to get you. And if someone comes along and gives them a little gold and says, go hack up defenseless white women, they're gonna do it. Imagine then how this fits into the belief system of certain Americans at the time, meaning U.S. citizens, how it will, again, justify some of our actions vis-a-vis these people. If you think that they're not redeemable, if you think that they're completely savage, then of course they need to be eradicated, so people would believe. Now, in this case, I want to draw attention to a few other things here. Look at the faces of the Native Americans. They're twisted. They're full of, pure id, as Hughes says, meaning they are peoples who are showing all of their emotions. Now, John Vanderlin, who was, of course, classically trained, has actually stolen their poses once again from classical sculptures. But it's not really important in the ideology here. It's more about his stylistics. He knows that he needs to show his understanding of anatomy, and so he's lifting these body poses from earlier, basically classical sculptures. They are, as they will almost always be when they're shown as savages, hurting someone who is going to be understood as completely innocent. You'll note that Robert Hughes said there's very few instances where you'll show Native Americans in conflict with white men for an obvious reason. It creates an artistic problem in that if you show Native Americans in conflict with white men, you've got two choices, don't you? You can show the Native Americans killing the white man, which then would suggest to people that the white men are somehow not strong enough to stand up for themselves, or the other artistic problem being you can show the white man killing the Native Americans, but doesn't that seem too honest? Doesn't that seem too much like what was really going on at the time? And then you have to look at that straight in the face and say, oh, look at what we're doing. So instead what you do is you put into the story, again, the white defenseless woman. Look at the juxtaposition, too, of the coloration of their skin. Of course, Native populations are going to be darker. That is part of their pigmentation. But look at how white she looks. Look at how the light shines directly on her again. Remember what I said about that? That signifies that God is with her. The light doesn't really reflect upon the Native Americans in the same way. Now, it looks a little bit like she's looking up at the Native American, and she very well might be. That, again, implied line of her eyes, if you follow my cursor, goes right up past him. So we see this juxtaposition of pure anger and id and savagery versus the defenseless white woman. But it's also looking directly up at the light source to say, God will deliver me, right? She is a godly person. Now, I don't think this is brought up in your readings, but it's worth mentioning that this is also a kind of representation of perfect femininity at the time. Now, while one might believe that a white woman, who is going to be hacked up, and there's more to this than that, by the way, that I'll get to, might fight back a little bit, painters, particularly painters who are taught in the style of the grand manner and classical principles, know that what you're supposed to be doing is idealizing everything. So the ideal reaction of a woman in this time is not to bite, not to claw, not to fight back, because women are understood to be innately peaceful. They are non-violent creatures. That's the belief of the time. They should accept their fate with resignation, and that's what she's doing here. The final thing that I want to point out about this is if you look really carefully, and I'm sorry that if this makes me sound perverted or something, but it's a part of a lot of these pictures, you'll see a breast popping out here and a little bit of a nipple there. Now, I have to point this out because obviously the artist has chosen to show us that for some reason. If you know what these women tend to be bound in, there's very little chance, right? They're corseted and kind of packed in there, so to speak. Very little chance of a wardrobe malfunction in real life. So when the artist shows us this, what he wants to intimate to us is that there's a possibility of sexual assault involved here. And that really gets people of the time angry, right? The threat of white women being raped by Native Americans, which happened with far less frequency, I'm sure, than it was represented. And frankly, it's more often the case that white men are raping others at this time, sorry, but it is a way to make people really angry about the treatment of, again, this innocent victim. It's an intimation of that. And just think, those of you who are fans of Western movies, or if you read James Fenimore Cooper's The Leatherstockings Tales and things like The Last of the Mohicans and so forth, how frequently in these stories white women are sexually assaulted by Native Americans or forced to become their wives and so forth. That didn't happen with the frequency that you see in the representations. It's part of our ideological way to demonize these Native Americans. Okay. Oh, I guess I should say this as well, that behind that, again, threat of sexual assault is also another threat that a lot of people were worried about at the time, something that's known as miscegenation, which is a very prejudicial term that means the mixing of the races. People kind of thought that the different races were like different species, or rather I should say some people, maybe the majority of people thought that. And so half-breeds, people that were part Native American, part white, didn't really fit into either world. Or the same thing happened with, again, slaves, our treatment of the black slaves in the United States, who were, as many of you know, oftentimes raped or sexually assaulted by their masters. Producing these children that were half was something that was a threat to a lot of people, and that's behind this as well. So, an artist you haven't seen so far, but a very important artist in the story of the representation of Native Americans, is Charles Byrd King. This is his Poor Artist Cupboard from about 1815. Charles Byrd King originally did the same kind of training that we've been talking about. Went to Europe for a while, got his training in the Grand Manner style, came back to the United States and tried his hand at painting, and people weren't buying his stuff. So he actually painted this picture, which is what we call a trompe-l'oeil picture, a fool the eye picture of hyper-illusionistic details in order to kind of lament the status of the arts in the United States. What you're looking at in the Poor Artist Cupboard is literally a Poor Artist Cupboard filled with all of his belongings. There is what is known as a cartouche up here. A cartouche is an illusionistic painting of a piece of paper that has writing on it that tells you something. In this case, it tells you this is a sheriff sale of all of the property of an artist who can't basically pay his bills. And then you see in this Poor Artist Cupboard the proverbial bread and water and books ironically titled things like The Advantages of Poverty or The Pleasures of Hope. Now the whole thing is painted so hyper-illusionistically because he wants to say, look at how much skill I have, and yet the American public doesn't support us. He finds a venue for his art, though, working for primarily the U.S. government, painting portraits, although these are curious portraits, of Native Americans who had come to Washington, D.C. to treaty with the federal government. Oftentimes these treaties would start kind of in the field, but the last little imprimatur placed on them, the little stamp of approval, would happen in D.C. And these peoples would come, and many of them saw this as quite an honor to get their kind of last stamp of approval. And while they were there, Charles Byrd King oftentimes would paint their portraits. He painted over 100 of these, but a number of them burned up in an early fire at the Smithsonian, so we just have a handful of these left. This one is, for the purposes of this class, we'll call it Young Omaha War Eagle, Pawnees and Little Missouri. Frankly, as your reading points out, we're not entirely sure what the heck we're looking at here, because it doesn't seem to be the case that we're looking at 5 different individuals. It looks like we're looking at probably 2 individuals represented at various composites, as if the artist, or maybe they're twins, I don't know, no one quite knows this, but as if the artist is just kind of giving you 5 different heads rather than 5 different individuals. So in this case, what we're looking at, the stereotypical representation that we're looking at, is one that we've already encountered, the noble savage. And the way that we see that noble savagery here has to do with the way that these portraits of these Native Americans are stylistically borrowing something that was a part of earlier traditions of representing gentlemen or the elite in European culture. And what I mean by that is that this posture of your chin slightly up, looking slightly above and off into the beyond of the viewport of the viewer is the standard way of representing gentlemen in Europe. So you're basically representing a picture in the manner that you would any other white European. But what makes it different, what adds the savage part to the nobility, is what they're wearing, what their hairstyles look like, and so forth. So remember what a noble savage means. It means that there's this belief that Native Americans are born innately noble, or there's some kind of nobility in them, but it hasn't been fostered by civilization, and it's our duty to foster that civilized component of, or civilize their savagery, to bring out the true nobility that's there. It is, as I said last time, a very paternalistic attitude towards our cultural others, saying they're a little bit like children. They have this nobility, but they don't know any better. We have to bring them into civilization. And civilization for us meant our civilization and our religion, our ways, not their ways. You'll read in your readings a lot of Native Americans being very smart and savvy about what was happening here, realizing pretty quickly, as of course they would, that white culture really didn't get that they had their own religions, their own spiritual practices, their own civilization that just wasn't even being paid attention to. So, with that being said, let's talk about what we actually see here. This is part of that exoticization of the other, the focus on things that made them look different without any explanation of what those things were. Many times these people would show up in Washington with Western clothing on because they had been, again, trading with Westerners for over 200 years now. But, as was the case over and again with people like Charles Byrd King, and later on with photographers such as famously Edward Curtis, we would ask them to don ceremonial garb or put on traditional clothing to really associate them with this earlier savage state, because it was something that we liked, something that was a curiosity to us, something that was romantic to us. So in this case, they're wearing animal furs. Fine, these people wore those types of things. They're wearing lots of jewelry, and in this case, that jewelry is actually Western for the most part, and I'll come back to that for a minute. And then lots of body face painting and their hair made up and so forth. In his hand in the foreground is a particular kind of weapon that is an adaptation, believe it or not, of earlier kinds of clubs, oftentimes called a gun butt club, that has that strange shape to it, a kind of bent, almost boomerang shape, that then was later included these Western-made steel blades that they had traded for. Earlier on, there were various rock blades in there, but this is a Western blade. So it's a kind of little cue here when you see that earlier traditions and successful trade with Native American or with Westerners have led to the adoption of this a little bit more advanced weapon, and with, again, the presumption being, with more time and more civilization, they will progress even further. Going back to these then Western jewelries that you see here, the beads in their ears, some of which are Western made and some of which are, part of their traditions, and the glass beads around their neck, there's a pretty complicated history behind this. We traded Native American groups things that were very cheap for us to produce, like these glass beads, for things that netted us an immense profit in our own market. So you'd trade, for instance, glass beads for animal pelts and so forth. It would cost us almost nothing, and then we would sell the animal pelts for a huge profit. Native Americans, not having access to these things, saw these as quite precious, and within their own economy, it has to be said, they did have a very high value. They just didn't have any high value in our culture. For us, though, in the West, when we would see Native Americans wearing these baubles, these things that, were throwaway, castaway, cheap jewelry, it was just a sign to us how naive they were. The final piece of jewelry that you see here is what's known as a peace medal. That peace medal is a very honored medal among various Native American groups, at least early on. Later on, they're not going to like these things at all. which they would get when they would come to Washington to treaty. You would get a silver medal stamped with the face of the president of the time. This happens to be Monroe. And on the back there is a peace pipe and basically joining of hands, showing that a treaty has been reached and that the process of assimilation, frankly, at least in the eyes of Westerners, was accomplished and on its way. The final thing I want to talk to you about, though, is this. Along with thinking about these various stereotypical representations of Native Americans, I want you to think about the bigger stereotype, which has to do, or the more general one, which has to do with the way that we are almost always very curious about these things that we see as exotic in these others. And how often when you represent Native Americans, or you think of Native American or Indian or American Indian, these images just pop into your head, like teepees and moccasins and tomahawks and head feathers and face makeup and things that are part of their regalia, things that are part of special occasions. There's very, very few representations of Native Americans, let's say, just after they woke up and they're going about their everyday business, because we weren't particularly curious about that. In a way, this is, again, us fashioning the Native American according to our exotic expectations, things that we care about. As Hughes points out, these representations probably tell us more about white Westerners, early U.S. citizens, than they do about the peoples they purport to represent. So a couple of more images here just quickly to show you more of Charles Byrd King's images. On the left, little elk, and on the right, black hawk here. Again, noble savages wearing their regalia, wearing their peace medals proudly. Now I want to move to an artist who was working in the United States for a while, but is actually Swiss-born. His name's Carl Bodmer. And Carl Bodmer was someone who was brought to the U.S. With a devotee of a very famous German naturalist, Alexander von Humboldt. So if you know Humboldt State, it's named after this man. Alexander von Humboldt wrote this series of, he was just a prolific writer, but a series of investigations of various naturalist phenomena, including Native American groups, South American Native groups, the climate and nature, and we'll hear a little bit more about him in the lecture on the landscape. In any case, when Bodmer was brought along, it's kind of like those early artists that were brought with the explorers. His purpose as a trained artist was to illustrate pictures primarily of Native Americans and their regalia to accompany the documentation that was being taken of these peoples by this German naturalist who was a follower of Alexander von Humboldt. In other words, when he was representing, as you see on the right-hand side with this work of Forebears, who is known as Matatopa, and by the way, Matatopa is spelled two different ways, one in your text reading and another way in your reserve reading. The more preferred way is actually in your reserve reading, so I've retained that for your lecture guide. When he represents him, he not just very carefully represents what he sees as a very gifted artist, he also documents what these things mean. And when you do that, at least it seems to me, to some level, the exotic nature of these people, like just the oddity of someone who wears feathers in their hair and paints themselves up in this way, these traditions that are so alien to Westerners, start to become less alien. They start to become things that you can understand, things that you can make sense of. So, for instance, as your reading points out, we look at this guy and at first glance you're like, wow, look at all those interesting body markings, how curious. But then if you know that the yellow dyed great owl feathers in his hair represent the number of arrow wounds that he's taken in battle, or if you know that the yellow hand on his chest represents the idea that he has taken prisoners in battle, or if you know that this very proud red wooden dagger in his hair, or knife in his hair, represents the fact that this very proud powerful Mandan chief has killed a Cheyenne warrior or chief in hand-to-hand combat, you start to think these things mean something. They're not just esoteric weirdness, right? They have significance within this culture. And frankly, think about this. These things parallel ideas in militaries all over the place. Those yellow-dyed owl feathers, they're like Purple Hearts, aren't they? Or, the hand on his chest or the knife in his hair, these are like medals of honor that you would attain in any military culture. And this is, what they mean in this culture. Notice also that when Bodmer represents this axe, this hand axe, he doesn't represent it as you would by many other artists as an ancient artifact, let's say a stone axe. He represents it as an iron axe here because, of course, this powerful Mandan chief would have traded for things that are much higher value and better, and he shows him holding this. What I'm getting at is that it's often the case that artists will represent these Native American people as if they still existed before colonial contact, as if the things that really only matter in visual representations are these things associated with a pristine state before whites somehow, sullied them. I also want to show you this, though. This is an anonymous ledger drawing called The Battle of a Cheyenne with Matatopa. Ledger drawings, not to get too far ahead of myself, but you'll see a few of these at the end, were drawings by Native Americans, oftentimes on leftover pieces of paper, scraps by accountants. Sometimes they already had drawings on them, most of which were created while these groups were sequestered in reservations. And they adopt many of the stylistics that you can see in animal hide paintings of the time, very simple forms and so forth that are all filled with narratives. In this, I just wanted to show you the way that a Native American, an anonymous Native American, represented this mythic fight between Matatopa and a Cheyenne chief. And, you see blood going both ways and them coming together and the regalia of Matatopa and so forth. It's just a very interesting thing to me to see these people representing their own history, even when placed on reservations, in the visual language that they had for years used to paint animal hides. Another work by Carl Bodmer. This is Flying War Eagle, another Mandan, not quite a chief yet, but on his way up, a very proud warrior. Look at how much detail you get here. It looks very naturalistic, doesn't it? It doesn't look like he's making stuff up. This man he's got his single feather in his hair. He's got things that are symbolic of both spiritual protection as well as his social status, such as the bear claw necklace around his neck and the eagle feather fan. Both of these are symbolic of one's social standing. They're also protective devices within the spiritual traditions of these people. The fan you actually use to cool yourself down, but it's also used in various rituals. And then tied to his moccasins are wolves' tails that show you that he's killed enemy warriors in battle. This is a pretty good one in that you see how an artist works up, these are watercolors, by drawing first and then painting over the top of that. This one has not been painted yet. Or to show you a Native American woman here, this is a Teton Sioux woman, or Lakota woman, whose name I can't pronounce, so there's no reason for me to even mangle it. But just look at the detail, and in particular, look at the stylistic patterns that you see on her. Again, this is buffalo hide here, and how these are part of the decorative patterns that are associated with various animals in these native traditions that are very carefully rendered here by this artist, who is more interested in showing you what he actually sees than painting scenes according to his own ideological assumptions. So I wanted to set these two works together next to each other. Let me just pause here for a second. Sorry. So I want to put these two works side by side for you for a minute to introduce another artist with a very kind of interesting history, George Catlin. The work on the right is Matatopa again, forebears the Mandan. The work on the left is also Matatopa, but the work on the right is by Carl Bodmer, and the work on the left is by George Catlin. George Catlin was a little bit classically trained. He spent his requisite about a year in Europe learning primarily portraiture, and he was fairly successful in Washington and Philadelphia. But in 1830, he headed out to St. Louis, Missouri at the time, which was a frontier city. And then over the course of the next 6 years, he made about 5 long excursions beyond the Mississippi River in order to paint pictures and collect artifacts and a little bit of history of various Native American groups. He is then the first U.S. artist who actually traveled out west to these people in an attempt to document what he would see. You can see here, and what I'm trying to give you here is that to some degree, George Catlin is following the precedent set by Carl Bodmer in that he is trying to show you what these people looked like. He's not always entirely faithful, as your book points out, and in particular, we're quite suspicious these days of some of the things that he wrote down in his notebooks about these people as not being entirely accurate. But he was well-intentioned. He's kind of like the original Edward Curtis in a way. Over the course of these 6 years, and then later on he made other excursions as well, he will paint over 500 scenes of various Native Americans and their rituals and their gatherings and so forth. Some of those scenes are quite sketchy and schematic, and others like this one are fully worked up oil paintings. So I just want to give you this quote of George Catlin to give you a sense of what he's up to, and I don't want to say this is a bad thing, because comparatively it's really not, but I do want to point out some of the problematics involved in it. As he, quote, said about his motivation, "I have for many years past contemplated the noble races of red men who are now spread over these trackless forests and boundless prairies, melting away at the approach of civilization. Their rights invaded, their morals corrupted, their lands wrested from them, their customs changed, and therefore lost to the world. And they at last sunk into the earth, and the plowshare turning the sod over their graves. And I have flown to their rescue, not of their lives or of their race, for they are doomed and must perish, but to the rescue of their looks and their modes, at which the acquisitive world may hurl their poison at every besom of destruction, and trample them down and crush them to death. Yet phoenix-like, they may rise from the stain on a painter's palette, and live again upon the canvas, and stand forth for centuries yet to come, the living monuments of a noble race." So his intentions here are curious, and there's something I want to point to. They're what the cultural historian James Clifford once called the salvage paradigm. And this idea is that at a particular moment in time in which you recognize, in this case, the Native American culture's way of life going away, being killed off, you attempt to salvage this, not by protecting these people and their ways of life. Instead, you try to collect it. You try to represent it. You save it in a form that ultimately you have control over. In other words, if you collect their culture, you collect the way that they look, you collect their artifacts, you collect their stories, you've preserved and maybe allayed some of your own guilt. Some of the ways of life, but not the actual ways of life. They exist now as artifacts rather than real people that you have to deal with. And as you see in that telling moment in the Catlin quote where he says, "For their way of life is doomed," he firmly believes in this, as I think probably just about everyone did, that these people's way of life is associated with the savage state. Yes, there's some nobility, and wow, what a proud culture they are, and what curious ways of life. But frankly speaking, civilization has outpaced them, and this time is over. And that's too bad, so I'll document this, but not so bad that I'm going to try to preserve actually their way of life and give them space to continue with their traditions. So then, just briefly speaking, I wanted to say, you look at what he's wearing here, this buffalo skin with various drawings on it. Catlin's trying to show you a little bit of that, but it's worth pointing out that they really didn't document all the complexities that are part of these traditions. I just want to say that Native American groups tend to represent, especially these Plains groups, their narratives, their stories, their religious, figures in forms that are symbolic and in forms that are meant to communicate the most information to us that they can. I'll come back to this when we get to the ledger drawings. This is, again, I just want to show you a few of these. If you're wondering, what type of Native American stereotype are we looking at here, most of Catlin's works would be categorized under the noble savage. This is a buffalo bull's back fat, part of the blood tribe, from somewhere around 1832. You can see, again, this way of posing the Native American in a standard portrait pose that you would give to Europeans, but of course filling up the scene full of very, very naturalistic representations of the type of regalia these people would wear. By the way, let me just go, I'm going to go back to this just briefly. When I'm saying things like, we know that George Catlin is changing what he's actually seeing, part of this is because, frankly, we have, as you just saw, lots of artifacts that he collected as well as others of what they were wearing, and we can compare these to what he actually shows. But he also said some things that just let you know he's going to make slight changes based upon his own understanding of what was aesthetically pleasing. So, for instance, this quote about forebears getting ready for his portrait, which he is very proud to do and spent forever kind of getting himself dressed up, and had one would imagine forebears or Matatopa wanting to say, hey, here's who I am, here's all the things I'm proud of. I'm like we would if we were doing a self-portrait or taking a picture of ourselves. Gets all that ready and then shows up to be painted. George Catlin says of this, "Such was the dress of Matatopa when he entered my wigwam to stand before his picture, but such I have not entirely represented in his portrait, having rejected such trappings and ornaments as interfered with the grace and simplicity of the figure." I mean, again, those trappings, as he calls them, are the things that tell the world who he is. They're the things that he's most proud of, and we'll just never know how many times someone like Catlin decided to sacrifice that kind of, very realistic representation of the things that, in this case, the chief wanted to represent to the world for the things that George Catlin, as an artist, thought were more important. So, again, just wanted to show you a few of these scenes. This is another Catlin work of Horse Chief, who is a Pawnee. Same idea, right? With a peace medal around his neck here. Or this one, Watchful Fox, or Keokuk Sok, who is represented later on in life by Thomas Easterly, the famous portrait or daguerreotype photographer. Daguerreotypes were an early form of photography, by the way. And again, you just think about the way that the one by Catlin is early in the man's life, and the one on the right is much later in his life. But just look at the difference in the way that a daguerreotype, which is capturing every nuance of this guy's facial expression at least, although there's some complexities involved here as well, gives you a whole different kind of feeling of who this guy is. A very powerful figure, a very serious figure, and so forth, versus that kind of delicate, not very, I want to say not very powerful, but what I really mean by it is something like not very threatening figure on the left-hand side, who, by the way, holds in his hand this very famous type of weapon. Some of the most charming, I suppose, paintings by Catlin, who later in his life tried to take all of these pictures and sell them first to the U.S. government, and by the way, what he did is he compiled all these images, as you will have read, and he put on an Indian gallery in various parts of the eastern seaboard and charged people admission to see all of these paintings, accompanied by some of the things that he collected of these people, along with his own fairly questionable documentation of their practices. He did that for a while. It wasn't making enough money. He got into a lot of debt, so he tried to sell the whole group to the U.S. government for about $60,000, which was a huge amount at the time. They, of course, had no interest in this, so he lowered the price to like $20,000. That didn't work. So he took the Indian gallery off to France and, didn't make enough money there. Took it to England, didn't make enough money there. Ended up in debtor's prison and liquidated the whole thing for a very cheap amount. Slowly over time, the Smithsonian Institution has been buying these things back. So there's a really good collection of these in D.C. At this time, held by the Smithsonian. In any case, I was saying, here's Midday Sun, 1832, painting of a Native American woman, and, in front of her wigwams, behind it as they were called, showing her in a moment of kind of thoughtfulness. It's definitely the Native American as noble savage again, but it's showing you people's, and this is, I think, what's so charming about some of these pictures. I'm not going to say they're entirely informational about Catlin's work, is you get to see things that other artists weren't really paying attention to yet, such as various ceremonies that they would have been doing. This is the war dance of the Sioux, or Lakota people. And again, there's moderate documentation of what's going on here, but we don't really know all of the nuances of these rituals that were a huge part. Dances that were meant to invoke the ancestors and spiritual powers and create, a fraternity of warriors as they're getting ready for a big battle. Or in this case, Scalp Dance from the mid-30s. This one's been a bit sensationalized. We know that scalp dance has occurred. Most people have heard about scalping as part of various Native Americans groups' ways of showing the enemies that they had killed. Once they've been killed, you take their scalps, of course. But this kind of frenetic energy that you see in this sketchy form, and all of the scalps that are everywhere without any context of this, just plays up the idea of savagery among these people. Or buffalo dance, various rituals that were associated with the buffalo hunts. What I find very curious about both this and the last picture is that, yes, we know that these rituals occurred. This is a way of both, cultivating a relationship between Native American groups and this most precious of food sources and, frankly, resources through the hides and bones and all the flesh of these American bison. We know that these rituals occurred partially to ensure a good hunt, partially to build bonds between the society and so forth. What I find curious here, though, is how few Western weapons are being shown. After all, by this point, rifles would have been a standard component of lots of warriors' weaponry when they would go in to hunt the bison. That's not shown here at all. I love this one. This one almost looks like a cartoon. So we know that something like this would have occurred, a buffalo hunt, although I'm going to guess that Native Americans were a little bit better at it than this. They're dressed in white wool's pelts in order to supposedly sneak up on the bison. I don't think the bison are having anything of it. They seem very clearly to know what's going on. So then, I want to show you a few other representations by artists that, let's say, weren't quite as popular as the two that we've just talked about, Charles Byrd King and George Catlin. And in particular, I want to talk about this one and let you do a little bit of analyzing. This is a work by John Mcstanley called Osage Scalp Dance. And we've talked about scalping here. So now you've got a situation in which you see the representation of Native Americans in a kind of semicircle around the stereotypically innocent woman and child, right? You can't show a man because that creates all kinds of artistic problems, but you show the innocent woman here dressed in, white clothing, again, the light of God shining directly on her, holding her defenseless child with her as well. Native Americans are represented in almost absurdly dark in this picture. They don't show a ton of Western where the exoticism is played up at every turn with them wearing animal pelts and so forth, body markings. Again, I'm not saying this is inaccurate. I'm saying that it's very intentional not to show the incursion of Western civilization in these scenes. So we're seeing, again, the demonic Indian here to some degree, aren't we? And once again, you've got the woman and the child, and if you're wondering why the child isn't wearing any clothing, it's probably a reference to the idea that maybe this woman gets hacked up and that child is going to be raised by Native Americans, taken back to a more savage state. But notice something else as well, and it's hard to read, especially if you don't have a big screen in front of you. But this man who's about to hack her down with, again, this gun butt hatchet is being stopped by this spear that's being put across the path here. Now, why? And then look carefully at the one Western thing that you can identify in this whole picture. It's a peace medal. So what does that tell you? That this chief has treated with the U.S. government, he's been acculturated, he's learned civilization, and he's stopping these savage, demonic Indians from hacking up the defenseless white woman and child. Now, I show you this one work by John Mcstanley, but honestly, I could show you easily another 15 works that show almost the same type of scene. Another pretty popular artist at the time is George Caleb Bingham, who, again, was partially trained and then set his sights on representing over and over again scenes of the West, politicians in particular, kind of the advancement of civilization into frontier life. And one of his favorite subjects was Daniel Boone. This is a work that's called Daniel Boone Escorting a Band of Pioneers from 1851. Daniel Boone, of course, was famous as one of those pioneers. A pioneer, he was started as a trapper, was someone who would go off into the West and through his own ingenuity, hard work, heroism, smarts, would make use of this wildness that was given to him to prosper. He would usually have to, fight in conflicts against Native Americans. He'd have to battle the elements. But in the end, this heroic, again, Westerner would prevail and come back with bounty. So the pioneer was one of our original kind of natural heroes of frontier life. And Daniel Boone was one of the most famous of these. By the time that Bingham is painting him, he's already retired out on Lake Osage. He's actually something of a tourist attraction. He had put on various, he had been part of the Buffalo Bills Wild Circus and all of that too. So here we have him represented escorting a bunch of settlers into the West. He's leading ahead them, right? Rifle at the ready, very powerful look on his face, persevering, leading the white woman's horse. As your reading points out, this is an allusion to religious imagery again. This is like Joseph leading Mary and Jesus out of Egypt. This is something of a kind of biblical tale unfolding, but now in terms of U.S. progress out west. He also painted scenes, of course, at least referencing the idea of the demonized Native American. This is called concealed enemy, as if Native Americans were kind of hovering around every turn, just waiting to get us. Or scenes of, again, White women captured by Native Americans. This is captured by Indians from 1848. So the defenseless white woman and child now, and goodness knows her fate, being captured by these villainous Native Americans. Again, another way of demonizing them. And then one of his most famous paintings, and one of the most kind of odd ones, frankly, is this one, which is called Fur Traders Descending the Missouri, although it was earlier called A Trader with His Half-Breed Son, that when it was purchased was deemed too inflammatory, and so it was retitled. And it's a scene on the Missouri River of a trader with his, again, half Native American, half white son, and shows this way of life outside of civilized society. The trapper looks like, you know, your typical man of the woods. The Native American looks particularly kind of happy with his lot in life, leaning on probably a bed of animal pelts with a dead duck, or probably some kind of waterfowl in front of him, his rifle in his hand. It's just a scene of kind of the pastoral life. Maybe Bingham wanted to show this to create a little bit of controversy around the idea of frontier life, maybe unfolding in a way that wasn't entirely civilized. We're not entirely sure. And if you're wondering what this animal is, people have been arguing about this to lengths that I mean, I think it's a cat, but frankly, they argue about what the heck this is over and over again. Is it an owl? Is it a cat? Is it a baby bear? And so forth. I think it's just supposed to be symbolic of, you know, animal life out there in the West, whatever the heck it is. Every once in a while, but very infrequently, you will see a scene like this by Charles Diaz called The Death Struggle, 1845, in which we have a villainous Native American attacking a white man. Now, notice the way that this is encoded, so as to make sure that we understand who to identify with. The white man is on a white horse, right? White is something that in Western visual representations is synonymous with purity and goodness. The Native American, on the other hand, is on a dark horse with kind of wild, wild eyes on it. Notice how the way that we represent the white man is such that we can see his face and the fear that he has on his face, whereas the Native Americans, you see them from the side or from afar. It makes us identify with his fate. Once again, we're pretty sure that that branch is going to hold him up, and so he is going to be killed. But in order to make sure that we understand why it's occurred, we have 2 against 1 here, and the fate of him isn't entirely secured. Thus, again, bypassing that major artistic problem, which is why are we vulnerable to these people that we deem as inferior to us? I'm going to pause here for a minute, and when we come back with part 2 of this lecture, I'll show you a little bit of sculpture, such as this one by Thomas Crawford, and then I'll briefly go on to representations by Native Americans, primarily in ledger drawings.